provision an Azure ARM template and using an Azure ARM template and then deploy to the provisioned infrastructure of that template, all in the same workflow. So this is an overview of the process. You'll start out by adding your template to Harness as a Harness infrastructure provisioner. Once you have that, and that's basically just a connection to your Git repo and pointer to the template, or you can even do it inline here. Once you have that, then you take your infrastructure provisioner and you add it as the infrastructure definition. What this identifies is the ARM template resources as the target for a deployment. An infrastructure definition is basically your target environment. So then next in your workflow, once you create the workflow, you select the infrastructure definition that you created as the target for that workflow. In the pre-deployment of that workflow, you add a step that uses the infrastructure provisioner, and that's going to build the infrastructure from the ARM template pre-deployment and then deploy it to the infrastructure. So as you see here, it'll build the infrastructure, and then as in pre-deployment and then during deployment, it'll deploy to that infrastructure. So let's look at some examples here. Here's an example of an Azure web app template. And it's a resource group scope, and it creates an Azure app template web app as a provisioning target. So in Harness, first thing you'll do is you will create, let me close this, you'll create an infrastructure provisioner that points to it. So let's look at this example here. We named it ARM Dynamic Provisioner, and the scope is resource group. It has to match the scope in your template. And then we have a Git repository, and the name of the repository is Anil ARM, and if you look here, you'll see that's the name of the repository. And then we say from the main branch, grab this as the template, appservice.json, which is right what we have here. Okay, from the main branch. So now, if we go back in here, this is all set up to point and pull your template at runtime. So now we take this infrastructure provisioner and we add it as a target environment. So in an environment, we create a new infrastructure definition, and we say map dynamically provisioned infrastructure. And we point to that provisioner, we select that provisioner that we created. We select the Harness cloud provider to connect to Azure, the subscription to use, and here we have a reference to resource group. So this is a reference to an output from the template. If we go back to the template and scroll down to the bottom, you'll see these outputs. And here's the resource group output. This allows you to identify what resource group you want to use in the template. And then when you're building your infrastructure definition, you simply refer to it there. You don't have to hard code it here. You can use a different one each time. Now that we have this infrastructure definition, we can use it in a workflow and identify it as the target environment. So here's a workflow. When I created it, this is a blue-green workflow that deploys an Azure App Service. So when I created it, I select as an infrastructure definition the one we just created using the infrastructure provisioner. So now the resources in that ARM template are going to be our target deployment environment. And then in the provision infrastructure section, in the pre-deployment section of this workflow, you add this step called ARM Blueprint Create Resource. And this uses the same provisioner to create that target infrastructure using your template, pre-deployment. And here you specify the cloud provider, which is the same one you selected in the infrastructure definition, same subscription, and here you can select the resource group instead of having to use the reference. And so we target that as we set to create that target. And then down here in the Azure web app, when we do the slot deployment, we use these outputs again to identify the app service, the deployment slot, and the target slot, the staging slot and the target slot. So if we go back to our outputs, we'll see we have a web app output and a slot output. And these refer to the parameters file actually, so they're referring to two parameters. If we go back up and look at the parameters file, we can see them defined clearly here, the actual names. So if we go back to our workflow, we see that we're referring to the web app and the slot right there. So when we go to deploy, it will use those outputs from that template as the stage and target deployment slots. And then all we have to do is run it, and we'll swap this. This is a blue-green, so we swap the slots at the end of it. When we deploy it, and here's a finished deployment, in phase 1 here, you'll see that we do the ARM create resource, and we take your ARM template and we execute it, building the target resource, and here's it reaching steady state. And then further along we have the slot setup, using those outputs, and we have the target outputs in here as our deployment target. If we go back to the workflow, you'll also see in that step a parameter setting. And here we can point to the parameters file as well, or you can type them in manually. And that points to these parameters as well if you want to use those when you use these as part of the creating the infrastructure. And it's really that simple. It's a matter of pointing to your ARM template, identifying it as a deployment target, and then adding a step to your workflow to create that deployment target, and then using the outputs from that template for settings in the actual deployment object, in this case the Azure web app.